Giovanni Urbani came out with his article on chance in the world of art in 1962. This article argues that one cannot explain by means of the increase or the disappearance of distance, or the increase in the power of communication, the style of modern or abstract art, for the reason that this is not the dissemination of the product of a specific culture, like, say, for instance, if Confucius were to have a website on the internet and therefore be able to communicate with everyone simultaneously. But actually, that is true today. So we can see that that's not why abstraction or modern art has come to be a globally dominant form. But rather, what he argues is that it's because everywhere everyone is educated in the same way by 1962, in such a sense that the scientific training dominates the way of approaching beings, and so for it's a tree, and therefore that a certain manner of abstracting in order to grasp the so-called object, which we might understand as the negation of the abyss of being, or the negation of the Seinfrage, perhaps, and replacing it with enumeration, or with, so for instance, we can look, just to give a concrete meaning to this enumeration of things, we could look at a distant star system through something called a spectroscope, and then we enumerate the color spectrum, and then from that we can know what kind of chemical elements are in those stars, which may be many trillions of miles away. So this enumeration and this abstraction is everywhere by 1962, and therefore this is what he argues, is what Urbani argues, is that this is why this feature, which doesn't belong to any particular culture, dominates. And so, for instance, in my short story or micro novella, a la Mishima, intelligence, this is the core theme, is that so for instance, as expressed by something that happened in 1964 by the building of Worcester Hall on the UC Berkeley campus, which now I think it houses like the environmental science and architecture and design departments, was built in this modernist style called brutalism, this style with heavy on concrete. But that style is exactly a style which revolts against the total abstraction which had come in, and which people had become conscious of by 1962, as evidenced by this article on the role of chance in art by Giovanni Urbani. Okay, so then the question is, did these experts, did the people that came up with brutalism, whoever they may be, produce? So this is usually thought as a very ugly art form by let's say the ordinary middle-class citizens, let's just say in the simplest way. But it represents something new, a break from something which is founded on this abstraction of the sciences, and then breaks from it and tries to, in a way, humanize it. Maybe they failed. I personally like brutalist structures, but I don't live in one, so maybe I wouldn't like it if I had to I could be in one all the time. But and I will say also, in addition, it gives me a sense of superiority to think I have this good taste, and there's a considerable number of people that don't have the fine sense to appreciate this, just as people don't necessarily appreciate Antonio Gaudi, but that's a slightly different basis for the peculiarity of his sort of Art Nouveau or Proto-Art Nouveau or tangentially Art Nouveau style. So the question of intelligence then raised in the novella, or really it's I suppose by the standard way of thinking, it's like a short story, but broken into several chapters. This question is whether the experts can ascend from the thing that's now dominate and improve upon it in some way. Originally, this would have linked to the rise of modern science itself, but the modern science has become so dominant, and it expresses itself. It's like this Edward Said. I think of the Edward Said thing. Like Edward Said was a Palestinian, and his thing was like the global message is like it's just there, and then we who are not like mentioned in that. So, like for instance, like Palestinians live in a concentration camp, not a death camp, but they live in a concentration camp for the most part. Like Gaza Strip, surrounded by a fence, surrounded by people that hate them and want to kill them. They live in a concentration camp, but we don't hear that. We hear like, two-state solution, Palestinians, Israelis. Oh, Palestinians are bad because they use this strategy, which puts the killing of civilians first, and the motive of getting out of the concentration camp we don't mention. But then we say we act as though we're like some kind of equivalence of two countries, one beside the other, Iran and Iraq, who one practiced, Sunni Islam, and the other are Shiites. But it's not like that at all. So, but the message is difficult to get out. I was thinking of in this Said way, but in the same way, since all education in the world which is connected to media, so not if like you live in an isolated South American tribe somewhere that hasn't been informed that the rest of the world exists, then maybe that's not so. But for all like cultures that are affected by these things, we all have the same view of the modern sciences. But originally, the modern sciences arose through a process of refusing and rejecting certain elements, such as theological elements, such as, I'll just exemplify them by mentioning the version we find in Nietzsche, which is the good, the true, and the beautiful, but which in daily life became values. Values are Werte, auf Deutsch in German. Originally, there were educational reforms in 1848 in Prussia, which replaced all theological terms, especially these so-called transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful, but they also take other names, unity, and there's other ways to formulate it, but I use that as a simple way to go forward here, just to give a bare grasp of what the issue is. These were switched out, and then it was said there's two things. There's like something like social sciences are human Wissenschaft or something like that, and then there's like Naturwissenschaft or natural science. They're linked in some ways to older distinctions, Latin distinctions, and so on. But basically, they had the hard form of them was this sloughing off of the transcendentals, or the good, the true, and the beautiful, and replacing them with the notion of the fact, value, or fact, I don't know, Todd Saka and um, Verta. Um, this distinction wasn't complete at that time, but it was still made as a practical matter in all the universities, which were then the most dominant universities on the earth, or at least out of 10 of them, because Oxford and Cambridge also were quite dominant in their own way. Um, so it came to be that the theology was dropped off, and science came in, and it's more complex than that, because you could start with the Hume and Izot distinction, and you could move through a bunch of stages, and then you'd finally get to through Nietzsche, who was dealing with this, who grew up with this distinction, and then you'd get to Georg Simmel and how Georg Simmel's ideas, and Max Weber to some extent, were popularized in the American universities, which then after World War II became the elite universities on the earth, the most dominant intellectual authority on the earth. And then you'd see that in the same way, this, which was originally supposed to be a claim about there's an ordinary way of understanding and then a scientific way of understanding which is better, became sort of like, oh, we have a conviction that this is the truth, and even though it's not better in the full sense of like it makes life better, it became a fixation. So then you have this problem, is brutalism then like an improvement in terms of making life better, that people can live in it? And this was given up. So like the idea of postmodernism originally was like giving up this brutalist style, giving up the modern art, the modern architecture style, and also modern art style. And then you saw another wave, which is today, you hear it all the time about somebody like Zaha Hadid, or Starchitects, as they're usually called, came in, and this is another style which seems to be a planetary style or global style, but it also has a certain link to the art world. So you could see that there's some sense where it's again attempting to be something that's livable, but it's doing it on the foundation, totally on the foundation of the abstraction of the sciences. So there's always a consideration of certain optimization features and certain the flow of human bodies through space as understood through some kind of models and all kinds of things of that kind. But so the basic idea of the story is this question of like, is intelligence about going from something that already we're into kind of the shadow of that object, which is we would call the future, because the future always has to be somehow here in the present. It says that any investigation into the past is, as Foucault put it, archaeology, which is something like a interrogation of the present as a shadow of that interrogation. The past is the shadow of the interrogation that's happening in the present. These reflections lead to a position where we could possibly then have enough of a survey to, I think, get a sense of this most pressing kind of questions as they stand sort of as the claim to what we must believe in. So, for instance, I just give one main example. So in this whole horizon of the notion of the changes of these ideals, we get Hegel's claim, which basically hangs around some kind of egalitarianism in the sense like of one individual under the law being equal to any other individual under the law. And the question of equality, even though Hegel has questioned the notion of equality in some ways, he hasn't with respect to the equality of the individual, although plugged into kind of a political order in a certain way. But this question of equality then raises a very blunt question, which is like, is the equality then to extend to people that don't agree with this view? So like Kant has made this notion that liberalism is a kind of wager where you give people free speech, because Kant himself says the highest moral evolution, a being evolved to the highest moral evolution will not lie. That's part of it, and you're supposed to be able to deduce that from the categorical imperative, and he's made special polemics with people, which he said he regards this kind of polemics as like revolting, but he still did it because he thinks that's such a good example of moral evolution, which is a being that won't lie under any circumstances. But then he says the way you do this is you make this wager and you give people free speech on the belief that they'll eventually come over to this view freely, autonomously, as he says, like, from their own center of movement, from the suke, as Aristotle would understand it. Looked at that way, you could see that this leads to a question of is the one that knows that equal to the one that doesn't know that? Does this equality extend to totally? Now, in Hegel, he says there's a whole time that already kind of knows that. So we all kind of the evidence for that would be that we all kind of spontaneously agree to things like all men are created equal in some sense. Although I think there would be a lot of disagreement against that, actually. But somehow we all agree to, at least if we're Americans, we're ready to point to the Constitution or something and say, oh yeah, we have this right, or whatever. Maybe that's only because we're not really thinking about it and we're just saying, like, de facto, this is the law in the book and we know it will be taken seriously to quote that or something. I don't know. But if the issue of equality is pushed, it seems to have this sense. It's like if everyone in the same time, in a way, is living in a world where this notion of equality is in some way taken seriously, what about people who would come along in the future and who wouldn't believe that or wouldn't take it seriously? Or what? I mean, we could ask, it seems like a moot point to ask about the past. Like, what about the people who lived in the past and who, according to Hegel, weren't there yet? So, like Hegel says, Aristotle had a teaching about slavery, but Hegel, being in a more evolved time, being in the absolute moment where the truth is known, doesn't have that. Hegel's absolute moment is much more modest than Kant's. Kant insists on like this, his image is like, he thinks of all planets that exist in the universe, and he thinks there must be at least one planet where the full moral development has been reached, and this full moral development is illogical, and Kant can already know it now because he has a logical mind, and he can work out what the categorical imperative prescribes. But not everyone can do that yet, but he thinks they could still get there even without the categorical imperative, even without being able to understand the categorical imperative, but through the whole genus or the whole group, the whole race, would advance to where it instinctually understands it, that lying in any way is wrong, for instance, according to him. But this makes the question then, are the ones equal only the ones that have reached this moral plateau? But we could ask it more simply. It's just like, say Hegel's thing was true, that we're really in the absolute, then does it mean that only the people that are alive now are equal? It makes it totally a temporal issue, which is a strange thing about the question of knowledge. But then if we took it from the scientific horizon, nobody thinks that everybody thinks that in 3,000 years there'll still be scientific advances in some sense. Okay, maybe not everyone thinks that. Maybe that we have the notion of some kind of vanishing point or singularity, so-called, where that will no longer be true because something in a flash everything will transform. But it's still intelligible to say, in 30,000 years there'll still be scientific advancements, and then if science is the true knowledge, then are we actually equal to the people that live in the future that have that advanced knowledge? So equality becomes an extremely a difficult question, even though it's supposed to be the thing that's already sorted out in this question of like equality under the law.